The engines roared to life as Flight 447 prepared for takeoff. First-class passengers settled into their leather seats, adjusting noise-canceling headphones and opening magazines. The cabin hummed with the quiet luxury of privilege. Then came the scream. It pierced through the cabin like a siren. Sharp, frantic, and utterly inconsolable. Every head turned toward the source, a tiny bundle in the arms of a man who looked like he'd rather face a firing squad than hold her for one more second. Jorge Hamilton was 40 years old, 6'3", with shoulders that filled his custom suit like armor. His jaw was carved from granite, his eyes dark and unreadable. The kind of man whose entrance into a room made conversations stop mid-sentence. The kind of man who could silence grown men with a single glance. But he couldn't silence his own daughter. 3-month-old Maggie wailed in his trembling arms, her face red and twisted with distress. Jorge's hands that had signed death warrants without hesitation, shook as he tried to position the bottle near her mouth. She turned away violently, screaming harder. Sweat beaded on his forehead. His breathing quickened. Around him, passengers exchanged looks, some sympathetic, most annoyed. A woman in 2B pulled her eye mask down with theatrical frustration. A businessman in 3A muttered something about premium tickets and peace and quiet. A flight attendant approached with a practiced smile. "Sir, may I help?" Jorge's voice came out rough, strained. "She won't take the bottle. She hasn't eaten in hours. I don't know what else to do." The attendant tried, bouncing, cooing, offering a pacifier. Nothing worked. If anything, Maggie's cries intensified, as if she were searching for something that simply wasn't there. Another attendant joined, then another. They huddled around Jorge like medics at an accident scene. But the screaming continued, relentless and heartbreaking. A passenger leaned to his companion and whispered loudly enough to be heard. Can't he control his own kid? If only they knew. Jorge Hamilton controlled the largest crime syndicate on the East Coast. He moved millions in untraceable funds. He had politicians in his pocket and rivals 6 feet under. But here, at 20,000 feet, he was just a terrified father holding the one person he loved most in the world, and failing her completely. Because 8 weeks ago, in a sterile hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and death, Jorge had watched his wife take her last breath minutes after bringing their daughter into the world. Her final words had been, "Take care of our baby girl," and he had promised. God, he had promised. Now, as Maggie screamed, and passengers shot him looks of pure contempt, Jorge wondered if he'd made a promise he could never keep. The plane leveled out at cruising altitude, but Maggie's cries showed no sign of stopping. If anything, they grew more desperate, more raw. Jorge rocked her mechanically, his movements stiff and uncertain. This wasn't his world. He knew how to negotiate, how to intimidate, how to survive in rooms where the wrong word could get you killed. But this helplessness was torture. He closed his eyes and saw her. Elena, his wife's smile on their wedding day. The way she'd placed his hand on her pregnant belly and whispered, "She's kicking. Can you feel her?" The excitement in her voice when they'd painted the nursery together, arguing playfully about whether pale yellow or soft mint was better. Then the hospital, the emergency, the blood, the doctors rushing, the monitor flatlining. "Mr. Hamilton," the doctor had said, voice heavy with practiced sorrow, "we did everything we could, but you have a beautiful daughter. Beautiful, alive, motherless." Jorge opened his eyes, and the memory shattered. He looked down at Maggie, her tiny face contorted in anguish, and felt his chest tighten. She was crying for her mother. Somehow, in some primal way, she knew. She knew the arms holding her weren't the ones she needed. "I'm sorry," he whispered to her, voice cracking. "I'm so sorry, baby." I don't know how to be what you need. I'm trying. God, I'm trying. The passengers heard only fragments of his words, delivered in a voice thick with barely contained emotion. To them, he was just another incompetent father. They didn't see the grief carved into every line of his face. They didn't see a man drowning. A male passenger in 4C finally snapped. For the love of God, can someone do something? We paid for first class. Jorge's jaw tightened. In another life, a comment like that would have earned the man a visit from Jorge's associates. But now? Now Jorge just felt exposed, vulnerable. The one thing his empire couldn't control was the one thing that mattered most. Maggie sensed his stress. Babies always do. Her cries reached a fever pitch, and Jorge felt his own control slipping. His hands shook harder, his vision blurred. He was breaking. Right there, in first class, surrounded by strangers, Jorge Hamilton was breaking. Marilyn Nakamuli sat in the very last row of first class, her reflective safety vest still on, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. She wasn't supposed to be here. She was an aircraft cleaner, one of the invisible people who scrubbed toilets and vacuumed aisles after passengers left. But tonight, staffing shortages meant she'd been pulled from her cleaning duties and told to assist where needed during the flight. So here she sat, out of place, wearing work clothes among designer outfits, trying not to draw attention to herself. Then she heard the baby cry. Marilyn's entire body went rigid. That sound, she knew that sound. It wasn't hunger. It wasn't discomfort. It was deeper, more primal. That was the cry of longing. 25 years ago, in a small village outside Kampala, Uganda, another baby had cried exactly like that. Marilyn herself, hours after her own mother had died in childbirth. Her grandmother had told her the story many times. You cried for 3 days straight, Marilyn. No bottle, no comfort could soothe you. You were crying for arms that would never hold you again. The memory lodged in her throat like a stone. She looked toward first class and saw him, the man with the baby. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his head hung low. She could see defeat, and she could see grief. Marilyn had cleaned thousands of planes, walked past thousands of passengers. She'd learned to be invisible, to move through spaces without being noticed. But this pulled at something deep inside her chest. She stood slightly, craning her neck to get a better look. The baby's cries continued, and with each wail, Marilyn felt her resolve strengthen. She knew what that baby needed. The question was, would anyone listen to a janitor? Her hands trembled as she smoothed down her vest. She wasn't dressed for first class. She wasn't educated or wealthy or powerful. She was just Marilyn, a girl who'd grown up motherless and somehow survived. But maybe, just maybe, that was exactly who this baby needed. She took a breath and stood. Passengers glanced at her, confused by the cleaning vest in first class. She ignored them and began walking forward, her heart hammering against her ribs. What was she doing? What could she possibly say? But her feet kept moving, pulled forward by something stronger than fear. Maggie's screams had reached a crescendo that made the cabin feel smaller, the air thinner. Passengers were no longer whispering. They were complaining openly. A flight attendant spoke urgently into her radio, asking for guidance. Jorge sat frozen, his eyes glazed with exhaustion and despair. "This is unacceptable!" The man in 4C unbuckled his seatbelt and stood, his face red with rage. "I paid $3,000 for this seat. Either handle this situation, or I'm demanding a full refund and filing a formal complaint." Other passengers murmured in agreement. The pressure in the cabin was reaching a breaking point. Jorge barely registered the words. He was somewhere else entirely. Lost in the memory of his wife's funeral, standing at her graveside holding a newborn he didn't know how to care for. His second-in-command, Marcus, had put a hand on his shoulder and said, "Boss, we can find someone, a nanny. You don't have to do this alone." But Jorge had refused. This was his daughter, his responsibility, his promise to Elena. Now that promise felt like it was strangling him. A flight attendant knelt beside him, her voice gentle but strained. "Mr. Hamilton, perhaps we could move you to a private area at the back of the plane. Just until—" "No." Jorge's voice was flat, defeated. "It won't help. Nothing helps." That's when he heard footsteps approaching. Slow, hesitant. He looked up and saw her, a young black woman in her mid-20s, wearing a cleaning vest with aircraft services printed on the back. Her hair was pulled into a simple bun, her face makeup-free and honest. She looked exhausted, like she'd worked a double shift. She was the most out-of-place person in first class, and yet she walked toward him with purpose. The cabin fell into a strange, expectant silence. Even Maggie's cries seemed to quiet slightly, as if sensing a shift in the air. Marilyn stopped a respectful distance from Jorge's seat. Her hands were clasped in front of her, her eyes kind but nervous. "Sir," she said softly, her Ugandan accent gentle and melodic, "may I help you?" Jorge turned to look at her fully. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face haggard. He studied her for a long moment. This janitor who dared to approach a man like him. "Who are you?" His voice came out rougher than intended. "My name is Marilyn. I work on the aircraft." She hesitated, then added, "I heard your baby crying. I think I might know what she needs." A businessman scoffed. A woman rolled her eyes. The collective skepticism was palpable. What could a cleaner possibly know that trained flight attendants didn't? But Jorge saw something in her eyes. Recognition. Not of him, but of the pain his daughter was expressing. This woman understood something the others didn't. "What does she need?" Jorge asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marilyn took a small step closer. She looked at Maggie, then back at Jorge. When she spoke, her words were so simple, so direct, that they seemed to crack the very air. "She needs a mom." The cabin went absolutely silent. Even the engine noise seemed to fade. Passengers who'd been typing on laptops froze. Flight attendants stopped mid-motion. The angry man in 4C opened his mouth, then closed it again. Jorge stared at Marilyn, his expression unreadable. Then something shifted in his face, a crack in the armor, his eyes glistened. Her mother, Jorge's voice broke. Her mother died 8 weeks ago, during childbirth. The revelation hit the cabin like a shockwave. Suddenly, the annoyed passengers looked away, shame coloring their faces. The complaints died in their throats. Marilyn nodded slowly, her eyes filling with compassion. "I'm so sorry for your loss." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "But, sir, babies, they know. They feel absence. My grandmother used to say that infants carry their mother's heartbeat in their memory. When that heartbeat disappears, they cry not from hunger, but from grief." She gestured gently toward Maggie, who was whimpering now, exhausted from crying. "She's not just crying because she's uncomfortable. She's crying because she feels the emptiness of the person who should be holding her. She's mourning something she doesn't have words for." Jorge's hands tightened around his daughter. "I don't know how to give her that. I'm trying, but I'm not—" "You're her father," Marilyn said firmly but kindly. "And she needs you. But right now, in this moment, she needs the comfort of maternal touch. Just to remind her body what it feels like. To give her nervous system permission to calm down." She took another small step forward. "Sir, I grew up without a mother. Mine died giving birth to me, just like yours did giving birth to your daughter. I know what that absence feels like. even if I can't remember it consciously. And I know. She swallowed hard, emotions rising. I know what it means to be held by women who chose to mother me even though they didn't have to. Jorge stared at her, this stranger, this janitor, this woman who somehow understood his daughter's pain more intimately than anyone else on this plane. "What are you asking?" he said quietly. Marilyn's voice was barely audible. "I'm asking if you'll let me hold her, just for a moment, to comfort her the way a mother would. To let her remember, in her body, what that feels like." The request was so humble, so pure, that Jorge felt his defenses crumble completely. He looked down at Maggie, his daughter, his responsibility, his promise to Elena. Then he looked back at Marilyn, at the sincerity in her eyes. "Please," he whispered, "please help her." Marilyn stepped forward and slowly, carefully reached for Maggie. Jorge hesitated for just a heartbeat, then gently transferred his daughter into the janitor's arms. The cabin held its breath. Marilyn cradled Maggie against her chest, one hand supporting her head, the other wrapped securely around her small body. She positioned the baby so Maggie's ear rested directly over her heart. Then she began to sway, not bouncing, not rocking, just a gentle, rhythmic sway, the kind that mimics the movement a mother makes while walking. And she hummed. The melody was wordless, ancient, from her grandmother's village in Uganda. It rose and fell like a lullaby that had been passed down through generations of mothers comforting children in the darkness. Within seconds, Maggie's cries began to soften. The frantic edge dissolved. Her tiny fists, which had been clenched tight, slowly unfurled. Within 30 seconds, the crying stopped completely. The silence that followed was profound. Passengers stared, stunned. A flight attendant covered her mouth with her hand. The businessman in 4C sat down slowly. All anger evaporated. Maggie's breathing deepened, her body relaxing into Marilyn's arms, as if she'd finally found what she'd been searching for. Her eyes fluttered closed. Marilyn continued humming, tears streaming silently down her own cheeks. She'd never held a baby before, never had children, never expected to be in this moment. But somehow it felt like coming home to something she'd never known she'd lost. Jorge watched, transfixed. His hands were still extended slightly, as if part of him couldn't quite believe he'd let his daughter go. But as he watched Maggie finally find peace, something inside him broke open. A tear slipped down his cheek, then another. This powerful man, this Mafia boss who'd ordered hits and buried enemies, sat in first class and wept quietly. Not from weakness, but from overwhelming gratitude. From witnessing his daughter receive the one thing he couldn't give her, the echo of her mother's love. Marilyn continued swaying, humming, holding Maggie like she was the most precious thing in the world. Because in that moment, she was. A woman across the aisle wiped her eyes with a tissue. The angry businessman looked out the window, his jaw working with emotion. Even the most hardened passengers felt something shift inside them. They'd all been complaining about noise, about inconvenience, about their expensive tickets. None of them had seen the real story, a grieving father and a motherless baby, both drowning in loss. After several minutes, Marilyn looked at Jorge and smiled softly. "She's sleeping now." Jorge nodded, unable to speak. He reached for his daughter, and Marilyn transferred her back carefully, making sure not to disturb her rest. As Maggie settled back into her father's arms, still asleep, still peaceful, Jorge found his voice. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." Marilyn nodded. "She just needed to remember, that's all." "Your love is enough, sir. She just needed one moment to remember what maternal comfort feels like." She stepped back, preparing to return to her seat, but Jorge reached out and gently caught her wrist. "What's your name?" he asked. "Marilyn." Marilyn Nakimuli. Jorge looked at her, really looked at her, not as a janitor, not as a service worker, but as the woman who'd just given his daughter the greatest gift anyone could. "I won't forget this," he said. "I won't forget you." The rest of the flight passed in remarkable peace. Maggie slept soundly in her father's arms, occasionally stirring but never fully waking. Jorge held her differently now, with more confidence, more intentionality. Something had shifted in him during those moments of watching a stranger comfort his child. When the plane began its descent, Maggie woke but didn't cry. She looked up at her father with wide eyes, and Jorge smiled at her. A real smile, possibly the first since Elena's death. "It's okay, little one," he whispered. "We're going to be okay." The wheels touched down, and the cabin erupted in applause. But the applause wasn't for the pilot, it was for Marilyn. Passengers turned in their seats, clapping, some with tears in their eyes. The woman in 2B, who'd been so annoyed earlier, was openly crying. Marilyn, embarrassed by the attention, gave a small wave and quickly gathered her things. As passengers disembarked, Jorge waited until most had left. Then he approached Marilyn, who was helping collect trash from the seats. Back to her regular duties, invisible once again. "Marilyn!" She turned, surprised. "Yes, sir?" Jorge reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet. He extracted a thick stack of bills, at least $5,000. "Please, take this. You gave my daughter something priceless." Marilyn looked at the money, then back at Jorge. She smiled, a warm, genuine smile, and gently pushed his hand back. "No, sir, I didn't do it for money. I did it because I know what it's like to grow up without a mother. And because even though I never knew mine, I had women in my village who chose to love me anyway. I was just passing that forward." Jorge stared at her, stunned. In his world, everyone had a price. Everyone wanted something. But this woman, who probably earned minimum wage cleaning planes, was refusing a small fortune. "Then let me help you," he insisted. "There must be something I can do. Anything." Marilyn thought for a moment, then said softly, "Give her your heart, sir. Even the broken pieces. That's all she needs. Let her teach you how to be her father. That's the only payment I want." She picked up her cleaning cart and began walking toward the exit. Jorge watched her go. This extraordinary woman who just taught him more about love in 20 minutes than he'd learned in his entire life of power and control. "Marilyn!" he called after her. She paused and looked back. "Thank you for showing me that my daughter isn't broken, and neither am I." Marilyn's eyes glistened. "You're both exactly who you're supposed to be, sir. You're just learning how to be it together." Then she disappeared into the crowd of airport staff, becoming invisible once again. Just another worker in a reflective vest, unnoticed by the world. But Jorge noticed. God, did he notice? 3 weeks later, Jorge's penthouse apartment looked different. The cold, minimalist aesthetic had softened. Toys were scattered on the floor. A mobile hung over Maggie's crib, playing gentle music. Photos of Elena were displayed prominently, not hidden away like painful memories, but celebrated as part of their family story. Jorge learned to feed Maggie properly, positioning the bottle at the right angle, recognizing her cues. He learned that she liked to be rocked in a specific rhythm. Slow, steady, like the sway Marilyn had used on the plane. He learned that she calmed down when he hummed, even though he didn't know any lullabies. So he hummed jazz tunes, blues, melodies, sometimes just random notes. It didn't matter. Maggie responded to the effort, not the perfection. Most importantly, Maggie stopped crying when he held her. The desperate, inconsolable wails had faded. She'd learned that her father's arms were safe, that his heartbeat, though different from the one she'd known before birth, was steady and reliable. Jorge's criminal empire continued running smoothly, but his lieutenants noticed changes in their boss. He was quicker to listen, slower to anger. When a debtor begged for more time because his wife was sick, Jorge granted it. Something that the old Jorge never would have done. "What's gotten into you, boss?" Marcus asked one day, confused by Jorge's uncharacteristic mercy. Jorge looked at Maggie, sleeping peacefully in her carrier on his desk, and said simply, "I'm trying to be the kind of man my daughter will be proud to call her father." At night, before bed, Jorge would hold Maggie and talk to her about Elena. "Your mother had the most beautiful smile," he'd whisper, "and she loved you more than anything in this world. She's watching over you, baby girl. Always." But often, in the quiet moments, Jorge found himself thinking about Marilyn, the janitor who'd seen his pain, who'd understood his daughter's cry, who'd refused money but given him something far more valuable, hope. He didn't know where she was, didn't know how to find her. She'd disappeared into the machinery of airport life like a ghost. But he hadn't forgotten his promise. He wouldn't forget her. Jorge sat in his office late one evening, Maggie asleep in his arms. His desk was covered with folders, various charities and foundations requesting donations. His accountant had recommended he increase his philanthropic giving for tax purposes. Jorge was reviewing them mechanically, barely paying attention, when one folder made his hand freeze mid-motion. Naki Muli Community Fund, supporting orphaned girls in Kampala, Uganda. His heart began to pound. He opened the folder with trembling fingers. The fund was small, grassroots, run by community volunteers. Its mission, to provide housing, education, and maternal mentorship to girls who'd lost their mothers. The fund was named after Grace Nakamuli, Marilyn's grandmother, who'd raised her after her own mother's death. And there, on the list of board members, was Marilyn's name. She'd started this fund 2 years ago, using her meager savings. It was barely surviving, serving only 12 girls. But the photos showed their faces, bright, hopeful, loved. Jorge stared at the folder for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and called his accountant. "The Nakimuli Fund," he said. "I want you to set up an anonymous donation. Corporate channels, untraceable." "How much, boss?" Jorge looked at his sleeping daughter. He thought about the moment on the plane when Marilyn had held her, about the way she'd refused money, about her parting words. "Give her your heart, even the broken pieces." $2 million, Jorge said, "and I want it structured so they can sustain operations for at least 10 years. Hire the best nonprofit consultants. Make sure they can expand to serve hundreds of girls." "Jesus, boss, that's—" "And include a note," Jorge interrupted. "Handwritten. Don't put my name." "What should it say?" Jorge closed his eyes, feeling emotion rise in his throat. "Right. For reminding my daughter what a mother's love feels like. And for showing a broken father how to heal. This is for the girls who grow up motherless. May they always have women like you to show them love anyway." 3 days later, Marilyn Nakamuli sat in the tiny office of her community fund, reviewing bills she couldn't pay. The fund was 2 months behind on rent. They might have to close. Her phone rang. It was their bank. "Ms. Nakamuli, we need you to come in immediately. There's been a substantial deposit into your organization's account." "How substantial?" $2 million, ma'am. And there's a letter." Marilyn nearly dropped the phone. At the bank, she held the letter with shaking hands and read the words. By the end, she was crying so hard she couldn't breathe. The bank manager brought her tissues, concerned. "Are you all right, Ms. Nakamuli?" She looked up, tears streaming down her face, and whispered. He remembered. 6 months later, Jorge pushed Maggie's stroller through the park. She was 9 months old now, giggling at birds, reaching for falling leaves. She'd said her first word last week, Dada. Jorge had cried. His phone buzzed with a notification, an article. Ugandan Fund for Orphaned Girls expands to serve 200 children. Anonymous donor makes it possible. There was a photo. Marilyn, surrounded by smiling girls, her face radiant with joy. Jorge smiled, then leaned down to his daughter. You see that woman, Maggie? She saved us both. And someday when you're old enough, I'll tell you the story of the janitor on the plane who taught your father how to love you. Maggie grabbed his finger and squeezed. You're not alone anymore, little one, Jorge whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Neither of us are. And for the first time since Elena's death, Jorge Hamilton believed it.